us the ability to discover new things, and we've seen an explosion of that, and that is a real thing, but it is also a thing by the grace of God. However, as I mentioned before, despite our modern chronological snobbery, which is a C.S. Lewis term, he says, do not be chronologically snobbish. Don't look down your nose around the ancient people just because you came after them. And don't assume, as G.K. Chesterton points out here, that they were just savages because you're bringing your own stone axe to grind upon anthropology. These things are written for our learning and our understanding. So we have a tendency, as I mentioned before, to make the same kinds of mistakes that your ancient ancestors did. Now, one of the things that we're going to see tonight, and we're going to use the Bible is just going to be replete with these things. There are a ton of things in your Old Testament where people do really odd things, and we say, why in the world did they do that? All of those things, when you run across, and we're going to look at some of those tonight, because those are echoes of the way that people used to think about the world. I'll give you a little teaser here. Anybody remember after Naaman was healed? Remember Naaman? He went to go see Elijah. Or it was Elisha, actually. Elisha. And he said, and he was so grateful after all that. And he said, he asked for something. He's like, can I give you anything? And he said, no. And then Naaman asked for something. Does anybody remember what Naaman asked for? Dirt. He said, can I take some big bags of dirt with me to my home? Super odd, right? Really bizarre. We're going to talk about that because that actually tells you something about the worldview that Naaman, and not just Naaman, but that all the countries around them had. So let's dig into some of those thoughts here tonight. So, some nearly universal worldview elements. First and foremost, in the ancient Near East, almost all the cultures that we see around there, and almost all the cultures worldwide, were polytheistic. And they were also henotheistic. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit. Polytheistic in that there was a wide range of gods that might be worshipped. And so in that way, there was widespread, the norm amongst the nations that Israel lived in was what you might call spiritual adultery. So the norm when Israel went to is you could worship a multitude of gods, and you weren't necessarily dedicated to any one particular god. And that widespread spiritual adultery often gave rise to human adultery. But some faithfulness to some gods was sometimes expected. So let's look at a couple different verses here. So look over in 1 Samuel chapter 5. I told you we're going to be all over the Old Testament looking at different examples of this. So let's look over at 1 Samuel chapter 5. Now this is after, this is Hophni and Phinehas, and they take the ark with them into battle against the Philistines, and of course they lose. And look at what the Philistines did. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. And when the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. That's kind of weird, right? In the previous passage, when they brought the ark into the battle, remember when the Israelites brought the ark into the battle in the chapter before this? And what happened when they brought the ark into the battle? Anybody recall? The Israelites cheered, and on the Philistine side, what'd they do? They were trembling, they were afraid. And they even had to have, like, the Bible even records this little mini pep rally that occurs over on the Philistine side. And they're like, no, act like men, you're Philistines, we're going to go into this battle. And then they take the ark of God and they put it in the temple of Dagon and they put it before Dagon. Now, what does that tell you about the way that the Philistines thought about the ark of God and thought about Dagon? Okay, sorry. Say it one more time, Lloyd. That they were equal, that they were beings of the same type. What was the other? I heard something else.
One and all are alike.
That one and all are alike. That this is a God like Dagon's God, and Dagon in this case was superior to Yahweh. And this ark represents Yahweh, and so we're going to put it in our treasure trove of things. In other words, these are not the gods themselves, but they picture the gods, and therefore our God is superior to their God in this battle, and so we're going to bring that in to our house out of respect for Yahweh and fear for him, but not, of course, a godly fear. Instead of one of a multiplicity of options. And so there's this henotheism. Now, henotheism means that we have a spiritual preference for this God. We recognize that there is a multiplicity of gods, but henotheism means that this God is superior to these other gods that we also believe exist. All right? So it's not monotheism, it's just the superiority of one God over a multiplicity of other gods. And that was very common. And we see that again, and look over in Jeremiah chapter 2. Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. So over there, the prophet, through the Holy Spirit, God says these words. This is the question that God asks. Has a nation changed its gods, which are not gods? But my people have changed their glory for what does not profit. For what does not profit. For my people, down in verse 13, have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So here God is asking, has a nation ever changed its gods? Has a nation ever, as of the time of Jeremiah, it was unheard of that a nation would just get rid of its gods. In fact, in Daniel, remember the last king of the Babylonian Empire was Belshazzar. Belshazzar is only on the throne because his dad, the popular god to worship in Babylon, was Marduk and had been for a long, long time. And his dad came along and he was a worshiper of another god, the moon god, Sin. And that really upset a whole lot of people because they felt like he was doing the exact same thing that God is talking about here, that he's trying to give up the gods of the Babylonians. And so he actually had to reign from exile. King Nabonidus had to reign from exile, and his son is Belshazzar, the very one that gets overthrown. So there's a little bit of history in this, but this is a common thing that's amongst those people. And as I said in the opening, so this is common amongst the ancient Near Eastern people. But is it any different with us today? The rhetorical answer to that is no. And I'll put this up here. In my particular opinion, American Christian henotheism is the umbrella idolatry of the day. What do I mean by that? It is my temptation, as well as many Christians' temptations, to recognize that Yahweh is God, but he is God over a house of many other gods that may have some place, that I may have set him up in some kind of a temple, and he may have the preeminent place in my heart, but there may be a multiplicity of other gods. And you remember in the very first class what I said about worldviews and people and the way that they hold worldviews? Most often, your worldviews are unconscious and they do not necessarily have to reconcile to each other. We like to think that we are logical beings, and we would say, "Oh no, I've got all my worldview sat real neatly. I've got it." To use Dean's acronym from last time, which I thought was so good. I've got my ADOPT acronym, and it's all nice and tight, and I know where my authority comes from, and I know what my destiny is, and I know where my origin is, and I know all these bits and pieces. But what do we know about people? We're not logic chopping machines. And we never have been. And so just like in ancient history, when the Philistines could conquer the Israelites and take the ark of God and put it before Dagon, what do we do every day? What do we do all the time when we sin? We would all in here readily say that Yahweh is our God. But many of us, just as people always have have set up a variety of little fiefdoms, little mini arks, little mini idols that accompany so many other places in our heart that at various different times may take the priority over God. And we like to think, because of our chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis would say, that surely could not happen to us. But this is once again where Paul is right, that these things are written for our learning and for our understanding because we have changed none. We know much more about the world and how it operates and how things are, and our worldviews have gotten much more complex in so many different ways. And yet, in this very fundamental way, we are exactly the same as we have ever been. Any thoughts or comments on that before I move on? Yes, Darrell.
In the Ten Commandments, you hear exactly the point that you're making. When he says, "You shall have no other gods before me," he's not saying ahead of me. He's saying you should have no other gods here in my presence.
That's right. That's right.
I think that speaks directly to the attitudes of the people that you're talking about, and would speak equally directly to us.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have any other gods that we put above Jehovah, but we shouldn't even have any other gods in His presence.
We need to be true monotheists, not henotheists. I think I saw another hand. Is there another? Jay, yeah.
I was thinking about David facing the Philistine. Nobody else in Israel had that kind of faith in one God to go out there like David did.
Right.
Obviously, other things were in their minds.
Right. Because, and this is a bit of worldview that I don't get to in this, but in the Hebrew worldview, the giants are descended from other gods. They may be gods. And so here David is staring a physical representation of something that is otherworldly. And in that scenario, he's the only Israelite to say, I don't care what I see, I care what I know. He's a monotheist to the core. So I think that's a good point. Another nearly universal worldview is this idea of anthropomorphism. And again, I put up a Chesterton quote here. The notion that primitive, and I put that in question marks on my own, men attributed phenomena to a God in human form in order to explain them because his mind and its sullen limitation could not reach any further than his own clownish existence. And we see that over and over again, do we not, in the Bible? What does Romans 1:21 through 23 tell us about the ancient peoples that we're talking about? What does it say that those people did? They gave up God and they substituted him for what?
Creature rather than the creator.
Yes, the creature rather than the creator, because in their clownish existence, as Chesterton puts it, that's the only way that they can conceive of the Almighty Being is to place him as some type of other created thing. The divide between creature and creator is such a massive gulf that the human mind cannot bridge it, so we just go to the biggest thing in the bucket, the most powerful thing in the bucket. Like cherubim have these faces, right, of these created beings that have power and strength and might, but they're still created things. And to bridge the gap between that awesome power of this created being to the ultimate creator, you can't picture it. So Romans 1:21 says, well, this is what people have always done. They've always resorted to painting their gods as the biggest, baddest thing that they could think of in created order. Yes?
As far as American Christians go, what would you say, or how have you observed some of our gods would be?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this is a great question. She said, what would you say? So I made the point that we're not so different from these people, right? And so Kim is asking, what would you say American Christian gods may be? And I want to use those qualifiers, American Christian gods. I can tell you what mine are. So I have the abundance of putting my faith and trust. I may be loyal to Christ, but I also have a tendency to put my loyalty in physical resources. As I think we're all, as anybody in here who has a 401k and thinks Social Security might not last, has a tendency to do. Because at sometimes, when push comes to shove, my tendency is to feel really good or poor about things based upon my physical circumstances that usually has to do something with the level of assets or money that you have. I think that's not uncommon. Jay?
But isn't that true of all physical things we
Of course.
save up?
Of course. It is. And I mean, I think that's legitimate, and I think that that's not new. Why is do you know what Pharaoh's main job was? Pharaoh's main job was to make sure that the gods were happy. And if the gods were happy, the Nile overflowed its river and we had enough physical resources to provide for ourselves. But if Pharaoh didn't do his job well, if he couldn't make the gods happy, if the Nile didn't overflow, he might get assassinated because he's not doing his job. And that's kind of the back and forth I mean. And I think that there's any number of gods that we might... Self. Perhaps the next biggest god is self. Over-reliance in the things that I can or cannot do on my own. So I have a little idol of Sterling that sits over in the corner, and we pull him out when we need him, but when we don't need him, God's takes center stage.
Well, like, let's say 150 years ago, when most people lived off the land,
Mm-hmm.
do you suppose that they were much different than we? They didn't
No.
have all the stuff in the bank and things like that, but
Correct. And I think what's happened is, this is not new with me, but the way we're not different is technology has not fundamentally changed us. Technology is just a force multiplier. So the way I've heard this popularly explained, in my pocket, now right there, is my phone, which probably represents the force of somewhere of like 100,000 servants. I am a king. I have 100,000 servants here. I have the manpower to go do all these things, right? But that hasn't changed me. But it sure can distract me and make me a whole lot more productive or a whole lot more miserable. But it has not made me any different. Just like the tractor didn't fundamentally change the farmer. It was just a force multiplier for what the farmer could do. And we've just escalated. And now you've got AI and everything else that will come
And Sterling,
after that.
I think Kim's point, I think what you're saying, Kim, is that if they didn't have the luxury of saving, then consequently, then a 401k, if you will, wouldn't be their God. You're right. But then it would just be the land.
Correct.
It would just be like how I almost this tit for tat relationship.
Right.
And I do think that's another parallel between polytheism of ancient days and some version, it's really not purely, but some version of figuratively polytheism today.
Correct.
Because it's a tit for tat relationship.
Absolutely.
The tit for tat relationship for the false gods of the ancient days is like just like keeping them happy.
Yep.
Well, we do the same thing with if I do this and this and this, then I earn this much. If I earn this much, then I've kept the money happy.
Now can be.
If my health is my God, if I do this, this, and this to my body, then I have a good relationship with my body. And then I think the scarier thing is we can do that with the true God.
Absolutely.
We can make a tit-tat relationship where if I do this, then I'm okay. If I
Yeah.
don't do this, I'm not okay. And yet when there's like this version of truth that kind of exists, but it's not really, it's not really true.
And I want to come back to that tit for tat concept because I'm going to get to that expressly in several Old Testament passages. I'm just going to quickly reference a couple here. Exodus 32, 5 and 6. As soon as the golden calf comes out, it's a calf, it's a bull. What do the people do? They rise up to play. They act like a bull. Psalm 115, verse 8, people become like the gods they worship. So people anthropomorphize their gods, and then they become like those gods because those gods are a reflection of the things that are already in their heart. We're no different today. The gods that we set up are a reflection of the things that are already in our heart, and then the worship of those gods brings out the very thing that was already there. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your gods are, there your heart will be also. It will reveal something about you, maybe that you didn't even know was in yourself. Some other concepts. So these are some other really, I alluded to this one. The gods of that time were functionally limited. So we like to think of our gods as being came out of the can. Everybody knew Yahweh was omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. But that wasn't always the understanding. And we've only come to that through further revelation. And that has naturally led to a kind of polytheism and a conflict inherent to creation. And let me give you some examples about that. In 1 Kings chapter 20, verses 23 through 30, the battle that happens there, and I've gone and forgot, and we don't have time to read it. But the battle that happens there is between the Israelites and another nation. And the Israelites defeat the other nation. When the other nation goes back, you know what they say? They say, oh, their gods must be gods of the hills, so we'll fight them on the plain. What does that immediately tell you about the way that those people thought about those gods? They're better than zero, but they're functionally limited, right? They don't have omnipotence. Their rationale was, okay, their God must rule in this area, so we need to attack the problem from another area. And that was the common reason, and that was common across all types of societies. I mentioned before Naaman's odd request. So this comes at it from the other angle. After Naaman's been healed, he bags those 2 things of dirt, and he says, I'm going to take these home. And oh, by the way, pardon me, when I have to go in with my master, he's going to kneel on my arm, and he's going to bow down and worship his gods. Forgive me when that happens. And Elisha says something to the equivalent of, it's cool, don't worry about it. He didn't say that. That's a paraphrase of the message or something. You can look it up later. But he takes these 2 bags of dirt. Anybody have any concept what he's doing with these bags of dirt? What does this dirt represent?
Well, he was still tying the territorial gods.
He was thinking the exact same kind of thing, but in reverse of what's happening in 1 Kings chapter 20. That this God Yahweh, who has healed me, he is the God of this patch of dirt. And that if I take this patch of dirt with me, even if I take it all the way back to where I'm from in Syria, that I can worship him, that I can bow down to him, that I can build an altar on this, and he will hear me because this is the patch of dirt that he is over. Jonah's flight from God. What does that reveal to you about Jonah? Yeah, and we look at that and we think, how silly. But really? I mean, there's anybody in here tried to run from God in one way or the other? I think we've all tried to run away from God in one way or another.
We would never act God one way with God's in this building, next somewhere else one way from the
Right. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. There was not to, and still exist in broad spectrums of Christendom, people who call themselves Christian, back to Durrell's earlier class, we too can fall into the idea that God is contained to this box here. And this is the primary place that he lives. And that what happens outside of here is kind of, well, maybe he's there or maybe he's not. Or maybe he's not there as much as he is somewhere else. And that exists in a variety of Christian. And whether it exists overtly, whether you espouse that, is irrelevant. What matters about worldview is what comes out your fingertips. That's what matters, but it also reveals something that exists in here. So again, another way that we're not so different from our ancient counterparts. Another near universal, and this goes back to the tit for tat thing that Dean brought up. Sacrifice. Sacrifice is a near universal value with various understanding of its utility. What is the meaning and value of sacrifice? What's very interesting is how quickly we get to the concept of sacrifice in the Bible. I mean, it is quick. with no explanation. Just right out of the blue, sacrifice is a thing. And it wasn't just a thing in that stage, but it was a concept that was kind of universally held across all ancient Near Eastern cultures. And it's interesting to think about how much this has changed in the modern man compared to the ancient man. Think about all the odd things that you have in sacrificial terms in the Old Testament. Remember when the priests, the prophets of Baal, are trying to get Baal's attention to burn up this wood? They haven't offered a sacrifice yet, but they're trying to get Baal's attention, and what are they doing? To the point that it said the blood flowed. I mean, that's a legit sacrifice right there. Then it gets even worse. How many times in the Old Testament do we read of ritual child sacrifice? And what's interesting about that is that as I looked at it in preparation for this class, that really was a phenomenon that was pretty heavily correlated with the Canaanite region, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Canaanites, and the Phoenicians. It was not something that was commonly done in Egypt. It was not something that was commonly done in Mesopotamia. But this particular type of sacrifice that was so egregious to God was done in those cultures. This is the tit for tat piece that I wanted to mention. Remember Jacob's bargain with God? Jacob's on the run from his brother who wants to kill him. And he says, God, if you'll take care of me, if you'll make the clothes on my back last, then I will go and I'll do this thing. And if you bring me back in peace, I'm going to come here and I'll sacrifice and you'll be my God. Now, I think in the context, that's not necessarily meant to be a negative on Jacob. But to the point that was Dean raised earlier, how often do we, as well as the ancient people, when those prophets of Baal were doing that, when any ancient cultures were doing that, what is the bargain? If I can get just a few minutes of your time, God, if I can just get a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
I think some of it is like us wanting a sign that what we're about to do is justified or okay. You know
Yes,
what I mean?
right.
Like that's what a lot of it is.
Right. I think that's a big element of it. Hey, can I just get a sign that this thing that I want to do is the right thing to do?
Yeah.
Now, sometimes we put the cart before the horse. Sometimes, hey, I'd like to have this thing, so if I give up this, will you give me that? Well, that's not new. Not by a long stretch of the imagination. People have been doing that with their gods for forever.
Well, Sterling, that's the whole point of sacrifice is, and Jordan Peterson does a great job with all this. We were listening to him. I mean, the whole point of sacrifice is the only thing consistent that we can see, no matter what you're sacrificing, is you're giving up something of value to the present to at least anticipate something of great value.
Yeah.
Everything about this, and we use that expression, well, I'm sacrificing this to get that.
Yeah.
So that's the whole point of the sacrifice. So yeah, we whether do the cart for the horse for the cart, we're still doing it.
Right. And what's interesting about that is so then, in so many different ways, God, in his wisdom that's given in his word, turns all that on his ear. And in Psalm 58 through 14, he says, I'm not hungry. I don't need your sacrifices. All the bulls on 1,000 hills are all mine. Everything is mine. I don't need your stuff. So he turns the entire worldview on its ear for that ancient people. I'm going to hurry through the rest of this a little bit here. So the other things that we see are that the gods were largely either amoral forces that are responsible for natural phenomena, or they're immoral beings. So frequently you have this idea that they're either just the forces that exist out there, or when they were actual gods, they were very immoral people. And frequently, the leaders of the nations reflected the values of their patron god, which we see even in the kings of Judah and of Israel repeatedly. They become like the gods that they worship. So when we have a bad king in Israel or in Judah, they do bad things. When God says, the idolatry or the wickedness of the Amorites is not yet full. It's because they're reflecting the values of child sacrifice and other things that they held, and they're filling up this kind of iniquity. But humans, it's also really interesting, and we'll come back around again to this when we get to apologetics. Humans still recognize that morality was a universal kind of value. This idea, this concept of justice, morality, fairness, it was something that everyone recognized is something. And so Hammurabi's code. So Hammurabi comes along in Persia, and there's a Persian god, this god Shamash. And Shamash is the god of justice. And therefore, there's this concept, there's this other figure out there. The Persians have Ahura Mazda, who also exists out there. And they recognize that outside of humans, there's this thing that exists that's morality, and that there's a right way and a wrong way of being. Despite the fact that the gods are either impersonal forces or they themselves are immoral beings, we recognize as humans and have from the very earliest age that killing someone is wrong. That there should be some level of justice and fairness in society. Now, I will tell you, the cause of Christ has greatly furthered the expansion of these things, but people have always known, even before Christ and in societies absent of Christ, still recognize that morality exists and that it must exist from some source. And so you have Hammurabi out there who's saying it must come from some being external to me, that it exists out there in the universe. And I don't know why it exists, but it does exist. And that will be an argument that we come to as we get to the apologetics portion of this class. But this is also why Israel stands, or should have stood, in stark contrast to their ancient Near Eastern counterparts. How did the law of Moses radically differ from the nations around them? And Darrell just taught a class on the law of Moses, and they did a great job talking about this. How does the law of Moses present a clash in worldview to the people that were around them? What was different about their worldview, or what their worldview should have been? What's different about the law of Moses from everything about them? There's not just one right answer here.
I guess you could argue the level of fairness was not the same. Like with it being transactional, it would be with the others of sacrificing this for this. But in some cases, with the law of Moses, it was sacrificing one for many, which then removes the transactional fairness from it.
Who's a protected class in the law of Moses? The vulnerable, which includes who? Widows, orphans, strangers. If you were a widow, orphan, or stranger in any of the surrounding cultures, in their worldview, what were you? Expendable in every sense. What God was trying to do in the ancient worldview should have stood in stark contrast to the way everyone else operates. Deuteronomy, these are some of the passages I hit over and over again because to me, I think they're so illustrative. Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 7. When all the nations around you and they see this law, they're going to look at you and they're going to say, what kind of God rules this nation that is so wise and has a God so close to it that they can call upon? That was the ideal that they were supposed to live up to. Now, what ended up actually happening? They absorbed the worldview that they were meant to counteract, and because of that, when Paul comes around in Romans chapter 2, he says, my name is blasphemed because of the way that you have acted. And these are the various passages that refer to that concept. So they have besmirched the idea, and there's just, the Old Testament is just replete with these examples of how they were supposed to be so utterly countercultural to everyone around them. Any other thoughts? We have about 2 minutes left. Any other thoughts or comments on that? There is one other thing. So one last thing that I think that we have to get to, the D and the adopted was destiny. And this is one area in which there was some progressive revelation that occurs. In the ancient world, the afterlife is a very shadowy, nondescript existence. And this makes its way into the Bible. In Psalm 6:5, it basically says, well, turn over real quick to Psalm 6:5. I want to quote this one exactly. Psalm 6:5. The writer over there says, for in death, in Sheol, there is no remembrance of you. In the grave, who will give you thanks? And this is the way that most ancient Near Eastern peoples operated. Their destiny was unknown. Now, as we get to the times that Jesus walks around and the apostles walk around, we're going to see greater clarity on that, and that's going to mean some changes in their worldview. Thanks for your time and attention.